Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Eve, especially. It's so interesting to listen to all of the adjectives used to describe your book. I just think they range so profoundly from difficult to amazing to transformative. And so I want to start with the book. And you have said that you had this realization that you could change the legacy of abuse, that you're in essence, that had been dawned upon you by your father. And I wondered about this realization, if this aha was intertwined with the writing of the book, or if it came first or during, and if you could just speak to the inspiration of the apology.
Okay. Well, thank you. And hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be in Berkeley. Yay! Woo! I was driving through the streets and I was just remembering being here I'm an emotional creature and living here and just loving this community so much, and I'm so happy to be back. Well, I'll start with the inspiration for the book and then get to the legacy of I just want to say that it's been so wild. I've been on the road now for weeks and weeks with this book, and it's really been a very profound experience, not only talking about it every day, but also just meeting people across this country and the UK and Toronto, and just feeling this real community of people who are longing for a way out of our current paradigm. And I just want to acknowledge that and how happy I am to be here in a community that I know is central to breaking the paradigm. And I rely on Berkeley and I rely on San Francisco for that. So thank you all for the amazing work you do here, because it's so profound. I think there were a couple of things or streams or impetuses that compelled me to write this book. One was that I was abused by my father, sexually abused from the time I was 5 until the time I was 10. And then when he stopped, he began to physically abuse me in very violent ways, almost murdering me a few times until I left home. And I think my whole life, I dreamed or imagined or waited for the day he would finally wake up and realize what he had done and apologize and reckon and make reparations for that. And that never happened. And then he died, and it's been 31 years since his death, and still that yearning for apology has been there. It's just like kind of a phantom limb. It's like one day that will come. And then I look at a movement to end violence against all women and girls that's really about 70 years old in this country, beginning with African American women who were literally fighting back against white rapists, moving on through all these years. And I've been privileged and honored to be part of that movement in a very big way for the last 21 years. And now with the recent iteration of Me Too, we've done a lot of work, women. We've called out men, we've told our stories, we've broken the silence, we've opened shelters, we've created hotlines, we've done a lot. And yet, in all this time, it occurred to me, I have never heard a man make a public, thorough, authentic apology for sexual or physical abuse, ever. Has anyone here heard that? No. Oh, did you heard one? Okay, well, okay. Yay, the first person in many, many states. But I have to say that I really look back and records and just was thinking of 16,000 years of patriarchy, that there were no recorded apologies that I could look to. And then it occurred to me that that must be significant, that we've never heard that. And so I started to think, well, maybe I could write the apology that I needed to hear, and I could create the words, and I could say the things, and I could go through a process that would set me free, and that maybe it could be a possible blueprint for what an apology might look like. And that was kind of the impetus which got me to start writing it. And I have to say that I learned a lot about apologies writing this book. It's a journey. An apology is a journey. It's a practice. It's not a one-off. It's not a I'm sorry, or I'm sorry if I hurt you, or I'm sorry if this felt bad, or that's not what it is. So.
And one of the things I want to touch upon, I think we will speak to how helpful this is to survivors, of course, but it strikes me that you are interested in the healing process for the perpetrators as well. And I would love to have you unpack that a little bit and explain why that feels important, in addition, of course, to the survivors.
Well, I think having done this work for so many years and having gone through so many emotional stages myself, where there was a period of time in my life I was simply in a rage at men. There were periods in my life where I just didn't even think about men. I've gone through every possible stage. I think looking at our movements, we're at a stalemate. I feel we've done the work of calling out, we've done the work, but nothing is changing on the other side. And unless that change starts to happen, we're going to be here for at least the next 11 years, if climate crisis is correct, doing this work to kind of no avail. And I think one of the things I've always felt, and I had the great privilege, for example, of working at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for 8 years with a group of women who were there for violent crimes. And in our writing group, every week that we met, the women went deeply, deeply into why they had done what they had done, what their motivations were, what were the exact things that they had done, what were their intentions when they did them, what about their childhood, what about their histories. And what I started to learn is that if we go underneath the story, if we go underneath and behind and we exhume and we excavate, we can begin to transform the story. If we keep going at things with punishment and more violence and punishment and more violence, we actually exacerbate the story. And so I think one of the things I learned in writing this book is I kind of learned like what the anatomy of an apology looks like. You know, what's the structure of, and if I can just say a few things about that. I think first of all, an apology is making yourself vulnerable. It's making yourself open. It's an equalizer. No one's above, no one's below. It's you two sitting here like this. I think in this country we have what I would call diabolical amnesia. We don't remember anything. We don't certainly remember our origins of how this country was even founded by committing genocide against the indigenous and the First Nations people who were here, onward to 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration. This is all, you know, not within the memory banks. And then we come into our own families where we're actually forgetting things as they're happening right in front of us. We have such massive denial that we're able to go, oh, that's not happening, that's not happening. And I think an apology is the antidote to amnesia. It actually says what occurred did occur. It happened, it is real. I think an apology is found in the details, in the very, very specific things that you have done. I walked into your bed, I sat down on your bed, I pulled the covers back, the very, 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 very specifics. And I think the liberation for the perpetrator and for the victim is found in those details. I think we generally apologize in this country. We say banal things like, I'm sorry if it hurt you, or I'm sorry if you feel bad, which usually makes us feel much worse, right? And I think the next piece of that is for the abuser to actually feel what the victim felt, what the victim is feeling as they're telling the apology to them. What impact did their behavior have on that person's life, and the life of their family, and the life of their community, and the life of everyone around them. And then for the perpetrator to say, how did I become a person who is capable of doing these things? What in my own history, what in my childhood, what in the acculturation inside patriarchy and toxic masculinity led me to become this kind of person? Excavating that and knowing that. And then finally being accountable, saying, I have done this, I own this, I am sorry, evidencing through all those things that you aren't possibly capable of doing something like this again. To me, that's an apology, right? That is not an easy, short thing that it's not a sound bite, it's not a Twitter bite, it's a journey. And I think we teach prayer in this country, right? We teach the petition of the prayer, the humbling of the prayer. We teach the concentration of it, but we don't teach apology. And we are wildly imperfect human beings. The one thing we have to get us through is apology.
It's a tall order, obviously. Yes, I do think it's worthy of applause. Thank you. To think that a perpetrator would be even capable of doing that. And so what I love about your book is that you've done it for your father in his voice. So it's, for those who haven't read it, in first person from your father's point of view. And I teach memoir, and so I know how difficult it is for people to write trauma on the page. And I was wondering what the experience was, I mean, just in terms of your approach to the actual writing, and if you had any practices in place to protect yourself.
Well, I think everything about this book was kind of shocking and new to me. I don't think I've ever had this experience before. I think once I made this decision that I was going to invite my father to write me an apology, and I kind of sat down and I opened the portal for him to come in, he came in. And sometimes I really don't know who wrote this book, if it was him or me, or both, or, I think all survivors know on some level that once a person has raped you, or beat you, or demeaned you, or hurt you, they actually enter you. They become to some degree embedded in you. And I think what I discovered writing this book is that in some ways I know my father better than I knew myself. I think if a family member abuses you constantly, you become very attuned to their footsteps and to the sound of their voice. You know how many drinks they've had or what mood they're in as they're calling you to come downstairs. And so I think my father was already well inside me, but there was also a dimension where I learned something about the dead. I felt him very present with me. And I began to understand that the dead really need to be in dialogue with us, that they are often struggling to find a way to get free or to understand things or to work things out. And so it was very, very eerie experience where sometimes I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I would hear him say, "Go to your office, I need to tell you a story." And I'd be like, "All right, I'll go to my office." And he would literally tell me a story. And a lot of the book, or a lot of the parts about my father's life, because my father was of the generation where men didn't talk, was a conjuring. Like I made up, I imagined a lot of what my father, his life was like. But I also feel like he was telling me a lot, and he was informing me a lot, and he was sharing a lot with me. And there were some times where that was almost unbearable. Do you know, there were moments when, particularly when I was dealing with the sexual abuse, where he would start to share his feelings, where I just didn't want to know his feelings. And I would have to stop writing for the day and just walk around and breathe and cry, or take my dog and curl up by the fire and just be in a fetal position for a few hours. But there were other days when I was really okay about the pain. And it was almost like I didn't have to be afraid anymore. Like the pain was there. And it wasn't about avoiding the pain. It was just like, let's go through the pain, you know? And perhaps I came to an understanding about the wound. You know, about a week after I finished the book, I had this kind of strange image in my third eye. It was like a mandala, and there was a circle, and then there was a circle inside that circle, and then inside that there was a little doorway. And I went, oh, that's the wound. And I realized that there's a portal inside the wound, you know, and if you go through the wound, it's very, very painful, but there is freedom on the other side. And we live in a country that tells us to be very afraid of pain, very, very afraid of pain. And so we actually park our buggies or our bicycles outside the door, and we get radiated by all the negativity pouring down from the wound. But if we're willing to go through the wound, and obviously one needs support to do that, and the love of friends, and a therapist, or clergy, or whoever one needs to be by their side, there's incredible freedom on the other side. And I think after a while, I started to realize this as I was writing the book, that the more pain that was coming up, the more free I was starting to feel in this weird, paradoxical way.
That's a relief to hear, because yeah, some of it is so painful to even read, let alone experience. And you had this incredible Mother's Day sermon that I watched on Facebook, and everyone should watch it. It's easy to find. And you told that story of the wound, and I was going to ask you about it, so I'm really glad that you brought it up, because this thing that you sort of said slightly differently in the sermon was, I thought anyway, don't park there right in front of the wound, right? That people camp out and make a life there, and that you did that for a while. And I'd like to hear now, in retrospect, what that was about and what you understand about camping out in front of the wound and this experience of going through it.
That's a really good question. Thank you for listening so carefully to that. I think in so many ways, having been so radically abused by my father, that my whole identity was really being a victim to his perpetrator and his abuse, and him as an abuser. That was the whole frame of my life. That was the event of my life. That was the wound of my life, right? And I think each one of us has a particular wound that in many ways defines our life. There are sometimes multiple wounds, but I think there is a central wound. And I think for so many years of my life, if I look at my writing, if I look at the work I've done, if I look at who I am, if I look at relationships, it's always been me being a victim to his perpetrator in some form or another. And I think I was comfortable there. It was familiar. It may have been painful, but I knew that pain. I know what that pain is. And it gave my life identity, and it gave my life form, and it gave my life structure. And I think what this book compelled me to do was to say, well, maybe there's another paradigm, maybe there's another structure, maybe there's another story that you're meant to live within, or maybe there's no story and maybe it's just free space. I don't know what's on the other side of this. But I think the world, it just seems to me, I was living my father's narrative by continuing to be a victim to his, that was his story. And I feel that's the story of patriarchy in a way. We're inside that story. So the question is, how do we break out of that story in order to bring in a new story? And I think by going through the wound, and I hate to use this metaphor again, but I always think of that movie Top Gun, where, when they go through that sound barrier, they're flying and it's like choppy, 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 and then it's like, wow, you're just in. That's what it felt like writing this book. It was just like, whoa. And then suddenly I was in clear space on the other side. And it really taught me that we can not only, I think one of the worst things we tell survivors after they've been raped or after they've been beaten or is like, now you're ruined and this will be your life. You will never recover, you'll always be broken, and that's like the second rape, right? Like you'll always stay in this state. And I think it's not to say it doesn't take work, and it's not to say it doesn't require attention, but you can get out of that space. You can have another life. And I think that's really critical if we're going to bring the human species into another paradigm and another life.
Well, I love what you're speaking to, because it's really a reclaiming. And I know from so many survivors that I know that it also kind of dips and then circles back. It's like a helix kind of experience. And so it feels like you've captured something special with this thing of writing the apology. And so are you encouraging other survivors to do this exercise? And then what words of advice or caution do you have?
Well, I think my first dream would be that men would feel compelled to begin to do this work. And I'm happy to see that there are men here. Thank you for being here. I really feel, and I can only speak for my father, who had a really big experience doing this, in that I really believe my father's free now, wherever he is. I really believe it. And I think when this book began, he was caught in a limbo rehashing and rehashing the crimes and the things he had done that he had never accounted for and reckoned with. And I don't think anybody gets out of here who's done terrible things without it poisoning and contaminating their soul in a way where there's consequences. So I think when people say, well, what's the motivation? How about freedom? How about being clean? How about helping and making sure that the person you have hurt gets clean and free? Those seem like pretty good motivations to me. So I would hope, and we've started this website called theapologybook.net, and we're encouraging people to send in apologies and to write what is an apology and why it's important, and everybody here is invited to send things in, and we're beginning to get apologies that are real and thorough and profound. So that's number one. But I would also say that I think I learned something really, really beautiful doing this book, in that if our abusers are embedded in us, which I believe they are as introjects, we can also change how they live in us. We can move them in another direction. And I think when this book began, my father was still a kind of monstrous entity or a monstrous force. And by the end of the book, he became an apologist. He began as this terrifying entity and ended up a broken, wounded child. And so in doing that, he lost agency over me. He lost power over me. I moved him here. And I think this exercise can do that. It can do that. I would not do it alone. I would do it with a therapist. I would do it with friends. I would do it with support. And I want to say it's an offering. It's not a prescription. Like, I know there are people who don't want apologies, who don't want to hear about apologies, and this isn't a have to. I don't even know if I could have written this book 5 years ago. I wasn't ready to do this. But if you want to do this, I think it's profound. And at City of Joy, they started doing this exercise a month ago there. And Christine Schuler-Descriver, who's the head of City of Joy, told me that she came into her office a few weeks ago and there were piles of letters. Women had been up all night writing letters from their perpetrators to themselves, apologizing, with great, great release and great success and change in their states. So I think it is a very profound thing.
And so about men, I'm curious what the response has been from men, and if you've had occasion to hear from perpetrators. I imagine there's been plenty of survivors.
Well, I'm a person who wrote the Vagina Monologues, then The Good Body, Emotional Creature, so I haven't really lived in the world of men for a very long time. I remember the joke used to be about the Vagina Monologues, people would say to me, "You mean only women come to see your show?" And I'd be like, "Only women? You mean 51% of the population?" So I haven't, but this book's been amazing because I've been invited onto all kinds of shows. I've been interviewed by so many men. And in the course of all these interviews, men have really been very honest with me about what this is generating in them, both fear and also hope. That they're looking for pathways, that they don't really know what to do. They feel stuck, they feel, and that it's really hard for them. And I always laugh and I go, "Hard for you? Let's look at that." I said this to one guy on a show. "You mean hard for you, meaning like hard, like after you've been raped and humiliated and degraded, coming out and talking about that publicly, that kind of hard?" And then they laugh and say, "Oh, point well taken." But what I've really been moved by is to see the understanding that men have had about this book and the way they've been writing about it and the way they've been talking about it. And every place we've been, there have been men in the audience, and men have been really open and really honest about saying that they are looking for ways to begin to work through things that they've done or to look at their behavior in ways where they don't just feel like they're going to be castigated or thrown against the wall or destroyed. And I think that's really something to think about. Like, how do we open pathways where people can begin to take responsibility, can examine their behavior, can look at their history without destroying them as they're talking about it, right? I think that's critical. And it's really taught me something about being more compassionate. And if men are willing to say, okay, there's a willingness, let's open the door and create groups and communities, ways that men can go and sit and talk about what they've done and begin to do this reckoning process.
I'm glad you brought up reckoning. They have a little bit of a layered question, but it has to do with that, because in reading your father, it was almost impossible not to think about our current president. There are so many parallels in their behavior, their experiences, and I thought, well, you have a lot of insight into narcissists who can't apologize, and absolutely finger on the pulse. And then I know that you've written about Trump being so triggering to women, and so it all kind of brings me back to this question of reckoning. You know, are we in this place of reckoning because of what we're going through with the political landscape, and do you have hope?
Well, I want to say that months and months before Trump got elected, I wrote this piece for The Guardian where I said, you know, Donald Trump will be our reckoning. He will be this country's reckoning. Because he is basically, you know, he's on top of all we haven't dealt with in the history of this country. It has all just gone like some toilet that's just risen up, you know. No, honestly, and I love those images in London of him sitting on top of that toilet, because it just feels like exactly what's happening. You know, it's just like it's all there. The history of racial injustice and racism, the history of misogyny, name it, history of immigrant bashing. It's like we are in it, right? And I think he's just the conductor of the toilet, right? I mean, he's just the manifestation of it. But what I really felt reading this book, and so many times I just get hit with the parallels, and I always felt this. You know, people tell me I was crazy, but months and months before the election, I started this group called Stop Hate, Dump Trump. And I tried to get people together to say that Donald Trump was going to win the election, and people kept saying, you've lost your mind. I have friends who still write me apologizing for the fact that they told me I'd lost my mind. But one of the reasons I believe that was I believed that he was almost like the archetypal example of the father so many of us have had. He was the example of that blind, but not the malign, malignant narcissism, the inability to feel, yet like that dominant character, that the person who appears to create security but makes you feel completely insecure. He just like mirrors every single thing, certainly in my childhood. My father was much better looking, but besides that, it was like, you know, and much more charming, I must say. But I actually feel, and maybe I'm just a hopeless optimist, but I'm going to be that till I die, because I'm of the Beckett school. I can't go on, I must go on, I will go on, and I'm staying there until somebody moves me out of it. I really believe we are at the reckoning point of America. We're at our reckoning. And it couldn't be more clear. And we have two directions to go in. We're either going to perish, or we're going to come into a whole new reality, identity, and paradigm. And I think, in a way, it's all here. It's all here. There's nothing that isn't black and white about it. It's absolutely clear. And I think writing this book, you know, somebody asked me the other day, would your father have ever written this book? And I said, absolutely, you know, if he were alive. And I said, absolutely not. You know, would Donald Trump have written this book? Absolutely not. But maybe if enough of us begin to germinate and escalate this other idea of another paradigm that is possible, that will become so powerful that it will begin to sweep in a whole new energy and possibility into this country. And I truly believe that is possible. I truly believe it. You see hints of it emerging here and outbreaks of it there, like whether it's the Parkland kids or whether it's the Sunrise kids or whether it's just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whether it's, we're seeing, here it is, you're just seeing the energy of it. 1 Billion Rising events, the Me Too movement. It's like everything is trying to rise up right now. And what we all have to do is say and ask ourselves honestly and deeply, do we want to sit outside the wound, or do we want to go through it and bring in the new world? Do we want to stay attached to a certain level of pain and a certain level of identity that's based on ongoing victimization, or do we want to go, no, we're bringing in a new energy and a new time that has to do with love and connection and people being accepting of people who are running to this country from countries where they are being abused and raped and annihilated, and embracing the way every single one of us, except for the indigenous, got embraced when they came here. You know, it's like we have a real choice right now. And maybe it's taken this kind of extreme life and death reckoning for people to wake up here. But if we don't wake up now, I don't know what will happen to this country. And I don't want to be, you know, I remember Helen Caldicott used to talk about nuclear war, and she used to terrify me to death. And I always thought, was that a good strategy? But in fact, it was for me, because I became a anti-nuke activist for like 10 years because of her. I think we are at a turning point, and I think all of us feel it in our bodies. You know, either we're going to work to stop these insane divisions that are based on patriarchy, where we're divided from our bodies, we're divided from our earth, we're divided from each other, we're divided, and then there's subdivisions within the divisions and divisions within those divisions, or where we're going to really say and make a decision that we're going to go in another direction.
I want that future. I want to circle back around to the anatomy of the apology, because I think it's an important point, too, with regard to public figures and politicians. I mean, there's been so much apologizing, half-hearted apologizing, hollow apologizing, to your point. And then you see, I mean, I see it online, people are infuriated, as you rightly said, about these half apologies because they make you so angry. I mean, you said what would be an appropriate apology, but that's never going to happen with a lot of these people. And so I'm just thinking about someone, perhaps, you know, annoying but benign, sort of, like a Joe Biden, you know, who apologized, but it wasn't enough, and people were angry. People were really angry, and I wonder if you could speak to someone like him, what you made of an apology like that, and what is good enough, given that no one is going to do this kind of detailed reporting like you're talking about?
Well, I actually don't think his apology was benign. I think it was bad. And I think Anita Hill is the only person who can determine whether that apology was effective, and for her it was unsatisfactory. And I think there are many reasons why it was unsatisfactory, and I think here's an example. He didn't make himself accountable. He didn't talk about what he had done. He didn't talk about the fact that he allied himself with Clarence Thomas and called Clarence Thomas throughout the trial. He didn't talk about how he had humiliated and delegitimized Anita Hill in front of millions of people, and by doing so, delegitimized and humiliated millions of women in the process. He didn't talk about putting Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court for eternity while he makes decisions about women's bodies that destroy us every single day. What did he do? Right? That is not an apology, and a half-done apology is actually worse, because it pretends to come up to it and then leaves you with the poisons all over again. I think he needs to do the apology tour, and he needs to go around and he needs to model what a real apology looks like, because otherwise, I'm going to tell you, he does not have the character to be a president, and he doesn't have the character to run a country. And at this point, at this reckoning, our next move has to be somebody who moves in another energy and another vision. And I think so many, I read a lot of these men who have been accused of sexual abuses, like Gian Ganeshi's apology and John Huckleberry's apology. They weren't apologies. They were poor me. Oh my God, look how my career was destroyed, and I was this fabulous person, and look how at the end of it, I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry for you, like this horrible thing. Those are not apologies. Those are not apologies. And I think, men keep saying, what can we do? What can we do? you can do the work that we have had to do in order to recover from sexual abuse. You can do that work. You can do that work. You know, women spend their lives recovering from sexual abuse, and men spend their lives covering for it. And both of those things take a life. And I think we have to now say men have to spend their lives going into the reasons why and what they did so that we can expurgate it and begin to move into a world where everybody gets to be free. That's the time we're living in now. And I want to dare the men here, and I want to challenge you, and I want to invite you. You know, Castro said we need 10% of the people to create a revolution. I have that over my desk. Not 20%, not 50%, we need 10% of the people. We need 10% of the men now to be that cadre, to come forward and say, I'm going to begin the process of reckoning publicly. I'm going to come forward and challenge and invite men to do groups together where we sit and we unmask and we tell the story of really what it's been like to be brought up under the tyranny of patriarchy. How from a very early age we got separated from our hearts, how we were told not to cry, how we were told not to be tender, how we were told not to express doubt or love mystery or wonder or curiosity, that we had to know everything and pretend we know everything, even if we don't know everything, because clearly we don't, because look at the mess we're in, right? These are the things that need to happen now, and men have to make that happen. Men have to make that happen. And I feel like I don't know what will be the catalyst for that. You know, we each make our offerings. This is my offering towards that. But I really do believe men have to be as brave and as daring and as willing as women have been all these years in finding a way to live in a world that doesn't want us, that systematically undermines us, makes us less equal, plays us less equal, and destroys us. Now men have to do this work.
I'm doing a hard pivot, if I may, to your mom real quick. And the reason is because I don't know how you characterize her. I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but women like her and other people like her would be called complicit. And I would like to know if you have done an apology letter from her point of view, or whether that would be necessary for her or other people like her.
I had a really amazing last years with my mother before she died. My mother's role in my family was it was a terrible role, and it was terrible for me because I was never protected. And my mother was of a generation where men were right, men called the shots. My mother was the fourth child in that family. You know, she might as well have been my father's, oldest daughter. My mother came from a poor family in the Midwest. She had no economic security. She married my father, who was this charming New Yorker. She was brought into this whole new world, which allowed her out of that economic insecurity. And by the time the abuse started, she had 3 children. And where was she going to go? She had no job. She had no money. Now, I'm not justifying my mother's behavior. I like to believe that if someone was hurting my daughter, but who knows? I wasn't in my mother's situation. One of the things that disturbed me about my mother is that she wasn't just silently complicit. I think after my father sexually abused me, it was very clear that he had he was obsessed with me, and he overly adored me. And it eclipsed everybody else in my family, so that they didn't get the attention they should have gotten. And so basically everyone in my family turned against me on some subliminal level and some conscious level, because it wasn't right that I was getting all that attention. And I think my mother despised me for it. And I don't know if she could articulate that, but when my father would become violent, or there were times when my father would be drunk and she would wake him up out of a drunk and tell him terrible things that I would do, and then he would go after me and he would be worse than before. And she was allied with him against me for a period of time. When my mother, after my father died, I confronted my mother and I told her everything my father had done to me. And we went through a long and arduous and very painful journey. And it was also hard for me knowing how guilty my mother felt, knowing how terrible my mother felt, knowing that I had evoked that guilt on my mother, you know, on one hand. But on the other hand, my mother got honest with me, and she finally called me one night at 4 a.m. crying, and she said to me, I realized I sacrificed you. I didn't want to be poor. And I let him do whatever he wanted to do to you because I couldn't bear the idea of being poor. And as horrible as that was to hear, it was also truth. And so I was able to forgive her because she told me the truth. We just want the truth. We just want the truth. When you hear the truth, everything just goes. Phew. And so we went on a journey, and by the time she died, I had cancer and she had cancer, and she died during my chemotherapy. And we had a beautiful, beautiful last night when I was really able to hold her in my arms, and I was able to love her and mother her the way I always wished she'd mothered me. And it was profoundly healing to be able to be here for her in that moment.
Thank you. This is going to be my final question so people can start thinking about their questions. You talk about freedom, and it does seem like this book has been a real opening and a real freeing thing. So what does that mean to you today to be free?
I think at the end of this book, like I said to you before, there was this feeling when my father said to me, old man, be gone. It was like the end of Peter Pan when Tinkerbell just goes, shh. I really feel he's gone, and he hasn't been back, you know. And that doesn't mean like all my neuroses is gone and all that is gone, but I'm not in his story anymore. And I don't know what story I'm in. And some days I feel like, wow, what is this world without that particular little frame? I always think of this wonderful woman named Betty Gale Tyson, who was in prison for 25 years for a crime she didn't commit. And I loved her so much. And I had the honor and privilege of being there the day she came out with her family. It was so emotional. But Betty had a really hard time outside because she'd been in prison for so long. And she didn't really like it out here because it was too vast and it was too big and there weren't any more walls. And she used to go back to get the soap, the prison soap, because everything else made her body break out. And I always thought about what cages do to us, how we get comfortable in our cages. They become the safe spaces that we know, even if they're painful, even if they're depriving, even if they're hurtful. And what it feels like out here is it feels really big and vast, and it feels a little scary at some moments because I don't really know who I am in terms of that frame. But it also feels like I don't feel afraid anymore. I don't feel afraid anymore. Like I feel like I want to love people, and I want to be embarrassed that I love people. I don't want to apologize for love anymore. Like we have to stop apologizing for love. You know, we have to apologize for bad behavior. You know, everything's flipped over, and I feel a kind of joy I've never felt before, even though I'm really tired. You know, I feel when I sleep for a few weeks, I'm going to feel even better. But I don't know. I feel like there is another world out here, and I'm getting a taste of what it would be like if we weren't under the bell jar of racist patriarchy. What it would feel like. And I think if we're going to build this world, we've got to be able to see it and imagine it and touch it and know it so that we can move towards it. We can't just be struggling and bumping up against their reality. We've got to say there's another reality. And that's the function of art, right? That's the function of writing and poetry and music is what's the world we want to go to? What does it feel like? I went to see Rocket Man last night, and I don't know if you've seen it, but has anyone here seen it? Oh, I just loved it so much. Because all through the pain, Elton John was just like finding the new world and finding the costume and finding the outrage and that's what we got to do now. We got to be outrageous. We got to live in the pleasure. We've got to be sexual. We've got to be alive. We've got to make it so beautiful that everyone's like, oh man, I don't want that world. This one is really much better over here, you know? And we've got to create that world. And I'm a child of the 60s, and I'm really happy I'm a child of the 60s. And I really believed, what people were saying then. I'm a hippie, and I've always been a hippie. And we've got to bring hippies back, and we've got to bring that movement back, and we've got to say what we knew then was right. We knew what we were doing then, and not be ashamed, and not apologize, and not sell jeans for $500 a pair, but just say, this is the world we want. So that's where I am. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, everybody. I am just going to say this once, which is a reminder that questions end in a question mark. Please ask questions. I know how tempting it is, especially with Eve here, to tell your story. And so, again, that's just fair warning. So we're going to ask you to line up. We have 2 mic holders over here. And I also imagine it's intimidating to get up and ask questions, but we have time set aside for you guys, so please do. Here come the brave ones.
We love you.
Hi, Eve and Brooke. I'm Lucinda Jackson, and I'm a proud She Writes Press author, so thank you especially to Brooke. And to you for your lifelong commitment to women. I appreciate that. So my question is about, I appreciate what you said about men having to do work, but I also see there's more work for women to do. And one of the main things I see is women's role in raising non-sexist boys. And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, your thoughts on, how women can do more to raise liberated boys, because I feel like in the next generation we could actually do that if we all committed to it.
Thank you. I want to say that I agree with you about raising non-sexist boys, but there's actually mothers and fathers who do that, so it's not just mothers, Look, I can't say enough how critical it is how we bring up boys. My father, in telling me his story, went all the way back, and one of the things he told me was that he was adored, right? He was born 12 years after the last child in his family. He was the accident that became the miracle, the golden boy, the divine right of kings. He was going to be the one who brought the family to the new promised land. And there is such a huge difference between adoration and love. Adoration is not love. Adoration is a projection of some idealized image onto another person that you expect them to hold for you, that you will live up to for you, right? But it doesn't allow them to become who they are or to be who they are. And so anything that doesn't match up with that adored image, they have to begin to cancel out. Vulnerability, sorrow, doubt, tears, humanity, just name it. And in my father's case, he just suppressed it and buried it until it finally metastasized into a whole other persona, which he calls Shadow Man. And I think we have to look at what we do to boys, how we cut off their hearts, how we don't let them cry. I don't know about any of you, but if I couldn't cry at least 2 or 3 times a day, I would be in a mental institution, okay? So what do we think boys are feeling? And I always say that I learned this story in Kosovo. It's a long, complex story, but it really was revealed to me that bullets are hardened tears. That's what they are. It's the tears we don't let boys shed. And I think when we rob boys of their tenderness, their sweetness, their adorableness, we kill them. We kill their hearts, we separate them so that they become very, very, very dislocated and disembodied people. And then we ask ourselves, well, how did my 18-year-old boy lie on top of a girl and rape her while she was screaming, no, no, no? Well, he didn't feel what she was feeling because he's not feeling. So I just think part of it is looking at what we expect boys to be and being very honest with ourselves, right? Are we really secretly wanting our boys to be tough and to man up and to protect us? Do we really secretly want that? Or do we really want them to be who they are? And if that involves wearing sparkle, wear sparkle. If that involves dressing in tutus, wear tutus and fairy wings. It doesn't matter. Whoever they are is who we want to nourish and bring into this world. So I think it's critical, 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 critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Eve. I'm Yamini, and I just so appreciate you. Thank you for being here. My question is a little different. It's, what do you feel about true, powerful forgiveness?
Okay. Okay, I have real issues around the word forgiveness. I always have. I just feel like there's so many religious implications, and it feels always mandated. Like, I feel like it's something you have to do. And I've just been around so many groups of survivors where they're being told, why don't you just forgive him already, and why don't you get over it? Or around African Americans who are being told, why don't you just forgive and get over it? I don't trust that, because it feels inorganic. It feels, I don't think the burden's ever on the victim to forgive. The onus isn't on the victim. What I do believe in is the alchemy of the apology. And what I mean by that is when somebody makes a true apology, as I outlined earlier, right, where they've detailed the account, where they've gone into your feelings, where they've looked at their history, something happens to you when you're sitting there. You can feel the tentacles of rancor and bitterness and rage and hate. They just go boom, 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 boom. And it's gone. And at the end of that conversation, you're done. You're not holding on to anything. And you're free. If that's forgiveness, I'm all for it. If that's what forgiveness is, I'm all for it. But I am not for this kind of, I can only say it feels like man-made. You know what I mean? It's like man-made forgiveness. It feels inauthentic, and it feels hollow, and it feels like in the end it can be more damaging. I've heard people say, oh, I forgive my parents, and I know they're walking around with masses of rage and masses of self-hatred, and it's all written all over them. And I think, what does it mean you've forgiven them? You know, you're still in the middle of the story. I can look at you and you're in the middle of the story. So I think if we're going to talk about getting to that place, apologies, reckonings, all have to be part of that.
Well, I just have to say that I experienced a really powerful forgiveness in my own life. And it wasn't, and I had forgiven him, my father, many times, and it was inauthentic. But I experienced a true, that's why I said that, and I think that there is a place for it, maybe with certain kind of people, not with everybody. I didn't have the same kind of experience as you. So my father and I had more of a psychological thing. But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. I wanted to hear some about your perspective about younger women. I have a 20-year-old, and I've been interested to see her understanding of feminism. She went to an Oakland high school and, you know, could have written books about racism and how that impact, but feminism and sexism, not quite as aware. And so I was wondering, in terms of your experiences, what you thought were some of the things that were hopeful about the experience of younger women and their understanding of feminism, and some of the things that concern you.
Oh, I'm not sure I get the question. I'm sorry.
Well, I think, like, for example, my daughter is at 20. She has a very deep understanding about racism and its impact. She has less, even though she's a strong woman, she has a less understanding about sexism. She just had an example. She just had started a new job, and she works at a gym, and the guy she was working next to, every woman that came by, it's like, oh, she's hot, she's hot, she's hot. And I said, well, that's sexual harassment, that's sexism. And she goes, really? You know, and for, you know, just like her perception of it is different, and it seems, you know, I feel like some of my understanding of isms came as my understanding of like how women are impacted. And I'm just, you know, I was wondering if you had the same understanding of the difference of young women's perspective on this.
Well, I think what you just did of pointing out to her what that was is how we begin to come into our understanding of what feminism is, right? I think sometimes we just get acculturated into a world where sexism's normal, right? So how do we just keep breaking it apart so people know that what's happening to them is oppressive, right? And I think they're really good books to read, they're really good movies to see, and I think just the way you handle that situation of like, that would be sexual harassment, or that would, like beginning to just bring up instances where situations in her own personal life where you can help her begin to see them differently,
Hi, thank you. So I'm finally in my 40s starting to write honestly about my father. My book that came out with Seal Press ages ago was very much protective of my father. My father's still alive, very much alive. So how does a daughter write honestly about her father when he's still alive?
I'm not sure I have all the answers to that. I mean, I think we all have to decide what is most important to us, right? I had an old friend who used to say you have to choose between dignity and family, which I always thought was really interesting. And I always kind of liked it, because I did a lot of writing in my early years that I don't think anyone in my family particularly appreciated. As a matter of fact, I don't think anyone particularly appreciated. It was pretty bad writing, but I think you have to make a decision inside your own soul what is most important to you. Is telling your truth the most important thing to you? Or is being in relationship with your father in a way that may not be telling the truth most important to you? And if you do tell the truth, can you withstand what will come up outside and inside you when you tell that truth, right? I mean, a week before this book got published, I had a moment where I went, wow, there's going to be a lot of people who know a lot about me in this book. And I had a major anxiety attack. I just had to go, okay, can you handle this? Can you handle what you're bringing forward into the world? And I made a decision that I could, right? And I walked through that moment of anxiety, but you're the only person who can determine what, and are you willing to trade off your relationship with your father for what might happen if you told your truth? And that's your own soul that you have to wrestle down that with,
Hi, I want to move the question slightly differently. I do work in support of the former comfort women, the women who were sexually enslaved by Japan during World War II, and it's thought now there were at least 500,000. And one of our big demands is an official apology from the Japanese government and accountability. And that one of the things that keeps these systems going, because they're not just individual systems, it's a systematic way of doing things, is that there's no accountability and there's impunity. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more on that level, especially given your work in Congo and given your work globally.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I usually talk about the comfort women because my sister Monique Wilson is here from the Philippines, and she's the director of 1 Billion Rising, and so is Susan Swan, the executive director of V-Day, and Leila Razan, who's our amazing team member in V-Day. But I've met the comfort women in the Philippines, and I love them so dearly. And many of them have died now, as you know, and many of them are infirmed. And they have been waiting literally 70 years for an apology from the Japanese government, literally doing vigils every Thursday, demanding and begging for that apology. And all they want is for the Japanese government to give a formal apology saying that what they did, they did. And I can't tell you how critically important I think that is. Like, I really feel we need to get that apology for the comfort women. And I'll tell you why. The comfort women were really the first group of women identified who suffered serious sexual violence, intentional sexual violence in war. They were held in rape camps for, for a long time, and they were raped sometimes up to 50 times a day at 14, 15, 20 years old. That impunity gave license to so much of the rape that we're seeing now systematically used in war. And whether it's Bosnia or Kosovo or Haiti or Afghanistan or Congo or Sudan, we can just go across the planet. And I really believe that the comfort women hold that story, that if we were to get that apology from the Japanese government, it would begin to link in accountability and justice. So I think it's really, really important, and I'll tell you a beautiful story. They recently said, because we have great alliances in our movement between the comfort women and the women in Congo and women all over the world, they basically said what they want now, more than anything, is for the women of Congo to get justice. That's how generous they are in their spirits, right? We are all linked in one story. When one group of women doesn't get accountability and justice, that allows so much violence to occur on the other side of the planet. Because it's the way our predator was elected gave birth to so many predators being elected in all these different countries. We are one world. So I can't tell you how much and how significant it is that we get justice for the comfort women from the Japanese government. And thank you for doing that work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi, Eve. I just wanted to say first how deeply grateful I am for the contributions you're making to the world and to love. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
My question is this: how do you think, as women, we begin to heal the wounded masculine in us, as well as with men, the wounded feminine that exists within them?
How do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm on that quest. I think you do have to go into the wound. I do think you have to dive deep and have to look at how we've lived in reflection to what we think is expected of us and how we do that. So I agree very much with that point that you posited earlier about the going into the wound. But I just came back from an experience that was with these very highly evolved men and it was a goddess trip, and these men showed up, so we were like, great. But it was so incredibly healing. It was so incredibly healing. And I was able to see kind of for the first time that really the work for me is the wounded masculine that lives in me. And I think a lot of us as women carry that because of how we've had to live. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that as women, how we do that work.
I think you said that so beautifully. I don't know that I have it. I don't know if I fully know what wounded masculine is, so I'm trying to get that. I think what I'm beginning to see is that there are places we can go and territory undefined. I don't know if it's masculine or feminine, but I know I've put limitations, and the limitations have been put in front of me. You know, I watched this documentary called Kim Swim. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but I met this wonderful woman tonight who swims in the bay, and I was so excited because she met this woman, Kim. But this woman basically goes swimming in the ocean, and she swims through channels, and she swims. It's unbelievable. It's not that the documentary is that exciting, but she is. She's literally had an accident where she's destroyed her leg, and then she can't walk, but she discovers she can swim, and now she's swum all through the channels, and she swum from San Francisco over, and I just went, oh my God, she just is going further than I ever thought a woman could go. Her body is doing things I never knew a woman's body could do. And I don't think she knew she could do that. And just watching her go and swim through jellyfish, through sharks, the things she was encountering along the way, and she was just like, And I was like, we are that powerful. Women are that powerful, right? And like, what do we hold ourselves back from? And so much of it's in our body. So much of it's in our body. So I think one of the ways whether we call it wounded masculine or wounded me, I don't know what it is. I think part of it is going in your body and finding the places where you're stopped, where there's a no, where there's you can't go further, where you can't do more, where you can't feel more, where you can't express more, and going there and seeing what happens. Even if it makes you weep, even if it makes you scream, because I think there's so many of these kind of energetic walls we put around ourselves, and it affects our writing, it affects our thinking, it affects our capacity to do things, but when you start moving it in your body, suddenly you're like, well, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, and you just begin to say, there are no limitations. Those limitations are imposed and self-imposed, you know? So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
You guys, as the timekeeper, I'm just noting that we have 10 minutes and we're going to wrap it up. So it seems possible that we could get through the 4 more people who are standing if we kind of keep them short.
So thank you so much, both Brooke and Eve. I'm a writer, and I've gone through that doorway of which you spoke. I've spent 20 years in recovery. And the two parts to my question are this, that even with all that work, and I work now with women writers, I still encounter, both in myself and in every woman writer that I come across, this terror to step into their voices. I know it's in me. Even coming up to here, I could feel my heart pittering. I was like, please don't fall down. And then the second part of that story, my question is this, that in that occupation of our voices, and really in that occupation of our truth, as we know it as women, is it possible, or what would it be like to not have to even deal with the emergence of an apology? Is that possible, that the apology may not happen? And what do we do then? I'm an Irish woman, and I'm telling you, the Irish government, predominantly male, the Irish Catholic Church, I'm still waiting for an apology, and I'm not going to be waiting, because I don't think it's going to come. So how do we move forward, both in our voices and maybe in the absence of apology?
Well, 2 things. I so know what you're talking about, that thing of terror, that there's always that terror. And I think, you know, again, I'm going back to the body, right? I think terror is lodged in our DNA cells. It's in our body. It's in our body. It gets injected into us over and over and over and over. And the only way I know how to do it is to free your body. Because so much of that terror is not intellectual terror. It's literally, you know, I've been doing a lot of research on witches, right? And what happened to witches. And basically, we torture, and all the basic mechanisms of torture were learned torturing witches, right? Whether it was the pear-shaped horrible thing that went inside women's vaginas, whether it was the Iron Maiden, where they closed it and put spikes into every part of the woman and let her bleed, whether it was dropping a woman in the water in a chair and seeing if she floated. The tortures were so unbelievable, whether it was lighting women on fire. I am telling you, we hold that in our ancestral psyches. We hold it in us. We know what those boundaries are, and we know what can be done to us if we go beyond those boundaries. And I really believe it's primal. It's primal. Yeah, and I think for every group, there is that ancestral genocide, that ancestral destruction, that ancestral slavery, that is the thing that stops you because you know what will happen. So part of it is, how do you move that out of your body? How do you move it out of your body so it isn't that controlling thing that prevents you from stepping into your voice? And even when you do step into your voice, I remember the first night I did the vagina monologues, and I stood on stage and said, I bet you're worried about vaginas. I literally thought a hole was going to open and I was going to fall through, or that I'd be shot with a machine gun. I was just waiting for it, right? And part of it is just doing it until you get the practice of knowing you can survive that terror. You can survive that terror. You're not going to die from that, Tara. And I think once you begin to do it enough, you begin to realize, okay, I'm still here. I'm still standing, you know? And the second part of your question, I think I've written the apology, so I didn't wait. In terms of governments, I don't know the answer. I think, you know, we have to keep going until, you know, do we believe in structures any longer? The patriarchal structures are ever going to give us what we want? No, we don't. Of course we don't. But until we have a new structure, we have to just keep pushing at them, I think, you know.
Hi. I've noticed how men in my life have had this fear you mentioned around the Me Too movement and sexual assault, and just having honest, reflective conversations about their experiences and actions. And you talk about this world where men have a path to be accountable and to give these real apologies. When we encounter this fear in people, like on an individual level, how do we react to it in a way that sort of shows this world and way to be accountable?
I think it's like, how do you move forward with men or guys in general who are struggling to, with their own fear and the ramifications of their actions? Like, what do you as a woman, how do you engage in conversation with them?
Yeah, when there's a fear around like even having that conversation, because they have this idea of like they'll be attacked and vilified.
Right. I think part of it is like opening the door to that conversation without attack and without malice, and yet with fierceness and accountability. It's finding that balance so that someone feels like they can speak without being like, gotcha, you're dead. which you know, I can't blame anybody for feeling that, because that is what comes up in us. So the other thing is to encourage guys to speak to other people, like counselors, like clergy, like, so that they can begin to have that conversation in a safe space where they won't get attacked. You know, there are a lot of therapists doing this work. There's a lot of restorative, there's a lot of men's groups who are doing this work. To go there first, where they can begin to speak that, because there's a lot of women who may not be interested in hearing it. And so where are the safe spaces that they can begin to find their voices and do that work of investigation? And I think part of it is, for me, and I'm working on this in myself, I just assume now that every person I sit next to is a traumatized person, and they've grown up in racist patriarchy. And how do I make myself more compassionate and make myself more available to listen to what their pain is and to listen to what they've been through, so they can begin to do that work, do you know?
All right, let's get these two last questions, and thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this work. It's really been wonderful. And I'm wondering, especially reading just the very first few pages of your book, and was completely struck that I'm going to be listening to this book through the voice. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm going to be listening to this voice of your father as opposed to you, which is what I was expecting at first. And so I'm just curious, what kind of a threshold did you have to come up against and pass through to be able to access his voice and being able to allow that to happen long enough to write an entire book through that voice? Because I cannot imagine.
What kind of questions did I ask him?
Just what kind of work inside of you did you have to go through, and maybe those were what kind of questions you had to ask him, I'm not sure, to be able to process through having his voice in you writing a book.
I almost wonder if the question that you're asking is, how do you tolerate it? You know,
Not tolerate it. It's more questioning what kind of a threshold, or you talk about you talked about it being kind of like
I would say it was like a threshold.
How did that happen?
I would say it was like a threshold. I would say that once that portal got opened, he began to speak, right? And I would say that each day there were some areas I felt like he went deeply, and sometimes I felt like he wasn't telling the truth. And so I would go back a week later and I would go, let's look at this section again, because I think you didn't really tell the truth here. And he would go deeper. And there was one section I went back to at least 10 times. Like he just wasn't getting it, right? So the only way I can describe it is that once something opened, he came in. I don't know how to explain it any better than that.
Hi, I'm Paula Wagner, and I'm also a proud She Writes author. Thank you very much. And I'm here today not just for myself to get your book, but in honor of my twin sister who was raped as a child by our school principal and the custodian. And this only came to light, when we were turning 50 as she recovered her memories. But I've come to realize that abuse literally smashed our relationship and robbed me of the most precious relationship in my life. And luckily, we've been able to recover and rebuild from that. But my question is, and maybe this is splitting hairs, but your concept of an apology and all the work that needs to be done by it, I'm thinking of the concept of making amends, the 9th step in AA, where to make amends to others, except when to do so would hurt them or others. And I just would like to hear if there's a difference for you, or if that's a model that people can follow. How does that, is that the same, or is there a difference?
As I was saying to that other woman, I think you're the only person who can decide whether making that amends is going to be a good thing for that person and you or not, right? I can say for me that I have never, ever made an amends or an apology that is deep and true and real that it hasn't worked out for me. That's just me. Because, and also the person I'm making it to. But that's in terms of the program and the 9 steps, I think what they're referring to in those situations is like, if you make an amends to a wife, you had an affair with their husband and they didn't know it, is that a good idea? I think there are things like that I think you have to evaluate, you know what I mean? But I think you can make an apology that you write out in depth and that you never even give to that person, and you put it into the ether and you ask that it be put out there if you can't give it to that person, and I promise you it will help you in a profound way.
The amends, but
What?
the perpetrator making an amend, how is that different from an apology?
Wait,
That's my question.
Is the perpetrator making amends the same as an apology?
Oh yeah, if the perpetrator, it goes through the process I was talking about earlier. Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Eve.
Thank you. I just want to thank Brooke for doing such an amazing job, really. Thank you so much. Thank you.